Today's stuff we're going to be learning is Ketubot Daf Samach. Today, this week's stuff is sponsored by Carolyn Hofstadter in loving memory of Fred Hofstadter's 8th yahrzeit. We miss you every day, Dad, Saba, and Great Saba. With lots of love, Carolyn, Adam, Michal, Josh, Benny, Izzy, Shim, Zoe, and Yehuda. Today's stuff is sponsored by the Levant and Dixon families, wishing our daughters Dahlia Dixon and Miriam Levant a Giyus Kal as they start the army today. May Hashem watch over them and may they have a safe and meaningful service. Batzlacha. Okay, before we start our daf, today is what I call the nursing daf. Okay, it's all about nursing women. It's going to be very interesting issues. Interesting to think that the rabbis deliberated and debated these issues. So with that, we'll get started. We started with our very interesting Mishnah yesterday about the responsibilities of a woman to her husband. And among those responsibilities, we saw this issue of her nursing her son. And that it's considered one of the jobs, so to speak, that a woman is supposed to do for her husband. And so I see you're asking about wet nurses. We already mentioned that in the Mishnah, that if she hired someone to do it, then she could lower her responsibilities, right? There was level 1, level 2, if she has 1, if she has 2. Okay, we'll get back to that issue down the road. But now, one of the things they wanted to say at the end of yesterday's daf was that Beit Shammai holds, right, other than our Mishnah, because Beit Shammai doesn't think that nursing your child is one of the responsibilities of a wife to her husband. Maybe you should anyway, but it's not considered one of these responsibilities because he basically says if a woman makes a vow not to nurse her child, it's a valid vow, okay, which according to Beit Hillel, she wouldn't be able to make that vow because it's not her right to do that. So basically we said, okay, the Mishnah is not like Beit Shammai. However, in doing that, they brought up Beit Hillel's opinion. Beit Hillel's opinion is kofeh umenikta, which is he can force her because it's one of her responsibilities. It's one of her rights. However, then he says that if nitgarsha, if he divorces her, ein akofa, he can no longer force her because again, once they're not married, so she doesn't have any responsibilities to him. So therefore, he can no longer force her to nurse the child unless what? The braita says, unless the child recognizes the mother, which means the child recognizes the mother and is basically only willing to nurse from the mother. Then he can force the mother, although he has to pay her, like a wet nurse, basically, because she doesn't have any responsibility to the husband. It's just mipnei sakana, they say, because it's dangerous to the child will only nurse from her. Therefore, we're going to basically insist that the mother do it. And now the big question becomes, how do you know? In other words, at what age can we assume, a very interesting question the rabbis are asking, at what age can we assume that a child recognizes the mother? Okay, very interesting question. Research nowadays will say even in utero, the child can already recognize the mother. Certainly after birth, very, very quickly after, child already recognizes the mother. Before I go on, I just want to point out one thing. I know we're in the middle of this, but I'm now remembering that I wanted to point out something. Somebody wrote me over the weekend something that was actually bothering me, which was this issue, and I'm sure was bothering a lot of you, the issue of the relatives doing a check on the woman about the blemish. Just want to go backwards for a minute. It seemed very strange that the husband-to-be, the fiance, will send his relatives to check out the woman, how they do the check exactly. So if you look in the Rambam, Hilchot Ishut, the last chapter, I think it's chapter 25, he talks there about that if there was no bathhouse in the city, then the man couldn't have been expected to know she had a blemish. But if there was a bathhouse, then his relatives would have gone and seen and known that she had a blemish. And there, it sounds like the way they would check was probably that the relatives would just make sure to go to the bathhouse when she was in the bathhouse. And there, right in the locker room, you would see her body, basically. And it wasn't like they went and, now it is true that they still go and kind of make sure to be there and check, but it's a little less invasive the way I might have potentially described it because I was having trouble figuring out exactly how this went. Anyway, from the Rambam, it seems that it was more in a sort of, how do you say it, a natural but not exactly natural way of doing things in order for him to check that there was a blemish or not. Okay, so I wanted to just get there and mention that before we go on. So going back now to at what point does a child recognize its mother? So again, modern research would say pretty soon after birth. if not even before. Obviously, there will be no ramifications before for this case, but for the situation. Amar Rava, Amar Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba, Amar Rav, so it's quoted in the name of Rav, Shlosha chodashim, 3 months. Ushmuel Amar, Shloshim Yom, Shmuel says 30 days. If you remember, Shmuel he had a science background, a medical background, so he might have been, you notice he's got the earliest date. He knows usually the best on these issues. For Rabbi Yitzchak, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, 50 Yom. So we have 30 days of Shmuel, we have 50 days of Rabbi Yitzchak in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, and we have 3 months according to Rav. To which Amar of Shimi bar Abaye says, Halacha ki Rabbi Yitzchak shamar mishu Rabbi Yochanan, the middle opinion, 50 days. So again, what this means is a child under 50 days, if the couple is divorced, the husband can't force the wife to feed the child under that age because we can assume that the child doesn't necessarily recognize his mother. But the sugya doesn't end here. Bishlamar Rav Rabbi Yochanan, kol chavachad ki chorfe. We get this idea about 50 days or 3 months, each child according to their, every child develops at a different pace. We all know that. So, a more quick to pick up on things child will do it by 50 days, later 3 months. But do we have such a thing? As Shmuel says, 30 days? No way, no how. Very interesting that they thought this. I was thinking about it. We all know that children start to smile and respond somewhere around 6 weeks to 2 months. And, maybe even some a little bit later. But I was thinking that maybe that's what they're referring to, the reaction. They assume, and I remember it was hard, my first child, until, you get a reaction out of your kid, you feel like you're just doing, and the kid doesn't even know you. Now, of course, it was clear he recognized who I was, but it's a different kind of recognizing and knowing. And once they start reacting, you feel like, oh, they really get who I am. But we know that that's not connected to recognition, but it could be that the rabbis understood that that was recognition and that that's how they knew. So now he says, but I don't get Shmuel. How could Shmuel possibly say 30 days? So now, Ki ata Rami bar Yechezkel Amar, when Rami bar Yechezkel came, he said the following thing. We've seen this line before in Rami bar Yechezkel. Rabbi Yehuda, who often passes on the words of Shmuel, was Rami bar Yechezkel's brother. And Rami bar Yechezkel says, Lo titzitinu lahani klali dechal Yehuda achim mishmei Shmuel. Don't listen to those rules that my brother Yehuda said in the name of Shmuel, because Hachi Amar Shmuel, basically Rabbi Yehuda, who brought these words of Shmuel to us, was wrong. Now, you might look back at this again and say Rabbi Yehuda didn't come up here, but some people actually have a different text of our Gemara, which says that instead of Shmuel Amar Shloshim Yom, it was that Rabbi Yehuda said in the name of Shmuel 30 days. Comes Rabbi Bar Yechezkel and says Rabbi Yehuda is wrong. This is what Shmuel said. Kol zman shemikira. What Shmuel said is, which is a much more scientifically accurate answer, each child, it depends on when he recognizes the mother. As we do a test, okay, you'll see what kind of test right now in a minute. But the Shmuel basically says it all depends on the child and the situation. We go and assess. Does this child recognize its mother? You have to realize here also, it's a little more than just recognize. It's recognized to the extent that he's only willing to nurse with this mother. Although they don't really talk about that. They seem to say it's just really recognizing. But that seems to be the issue here, that you can't hire a wet nurse because the child knows the mother and won't nurse from anyone else. I was thinking nowadays it's more, right, this is a less likely situation. You're going to try to have somebody else nurse your own child. Maybe you try that. Most people don't do that. However, what would be a more common situation, I was thinking that sounds similar to this, is they always say there's this window where if you don't get a child used to a bottle, they won't take a bottle and they'll only nurse. And it was reminding me a little bit about this. And in fact, it's usually around 4 to 6 weeks. If you don't introduce a bottle by then, they already are unwilling. And maybe that's similar to this, this issue of 30 days or 50 days. So anyway, now we have a story. A woman came before Shmuel. Amarle the Rabbi Bar Yosef zil bidka. Okay, they say, go check her. Go see if the child recognizes her. So what they do, okay, this reminds me of a lineup, like in a criminal kind of thing. So they do a lineup. They put a line of women, the mother being among them. They take the son and they basically pass the son from one to the other. When he gets to his mother, he looks up into her face. It was clear he recognized her. Now you have to remember the situation. She doesn't want to nurse the child. The husband is the father of the child, who's no longer her husband or ex-husband, is trying to force her to do it. So kavashtinu le'ena minei, she quickly looks down. Okay, now another thing about this is they're assuming, we're going to see this also further on, that they're assuming that the way the child recognizes is through sight. Okay, and also we know sight develops. It's not the sight of the ability of the child to see is much weaker in the very beginning of their lives. And maybe that's also where they were getting from this from, because they thought this was all about sight, even though we know that it's not about sight, that it's about smell. And that's how the baby in utero obviously doesn't see its mother, right? But smells the mother. There's all sorts of studies done about, they can smell the mother's clothes, all sorts of things. Anyway, they think it's clearly sight. So what does she do? She quickly puts her head down so the child won't see her. Thinking, right? It shows how they didn't know everything about, that we know nowadays, which makes sense. We have a lot more ability to do scientific studies. We do that. They didn't really do that in those days. So she looks down to try to avoid the child so that she won't be caught as the child recognizing her. Amarla netof enech kum dare brech. Says to her, lift up your eyes and go take your child, because he's obviously your child and you're responsible. And it's not he's obviously your child, but he knows that he's your child, that you're his mother, and you're going to have to nurse him. To which we end with this last question in the sugya, suma mina yad, because they assumed it all had to do with vision. What about a blind child? How does the blind child know? Amar Rav Ashi, berecha uvetama. Now the Gemara introduces it by the smell or by the taste of the milk. Okay, that the suma has other ways, but it still sounds like only a blind child will compensate by knowing its mother in other ways, but they still thought that a regular child did it with its vision. Okay, even though, again, we clearly know that scientifically the sugya is not as accurate as the discussion is. I mentioned this over Shabbos, and my son suggested that you might look at the sugya and say, like to a certain extent, sounds like a little bit of a crazy sugya, because sometimes his perspective was that the rabbis often delve into these issues in a very, deep way, like they're really grappling with it, and they're saying this opinion makes no sense, and how could he say this, and changing. And it's not really about the details in the sugya. It's that when it's a very important topic, which is a super important topic, because a mother doesn't want to nurse her child, and they want to basically say you're responsible to nurse your child. So because of that, they grapple with it in terms of all sorts of details that are maybe not the critical details of the sugya, but in order to kind of delve into the issue to say, this is an important issue that needs addressing. And it's not necessarily about the details of it, but it's about the concept of how important it is for a woman to nurse her son, especially in a case where she doesn't want to, and she's having a fight with her ex-husband about it, and she's maybe using it as a weapon against him, and I'm not going to nurse our child, and yet saying, it's very important that you be there and you nurse our child, because our child needs you specifically, and don't let this, get in between us. Anyway, you can think about it in that way. And anyway, it was just a thought. Okay, Tanu Rabbanan. Now we get to another interesting topic about nursing. Is there a limit to how long a mother can nurse her child? Okay, good question, right? You wouldn't expect a woman when the child's 12 years old to be nursing the child. On the other hand, we do know there's women who, some people do it for a month, some people for a year, some people for 2 years, some people for 5 years. Where's the limit? Is there a limit? So yes, there is a limit in halacha. Okay, Tanu Rabbanan, Yonek Tinok v'holech ad 24 chodesh. According to Tanakama, 24 months. And that's generally the time that they talk about nursing. It comes up with all sorts of issues. A woman is considered a nursing woman for 24 months after death. And this could be because, this could be even if she's not nursing. Like there's a period just called a nursing mother, 24 months. And there's all sorts of ramifications. For example, fast days, they don't fast other than Tisha B'Av and Yom Kippur usually, or they're exempt from fasting. Can't fast if you want, but you're exempt. There's all sorts of things. So you have 24 months. Mikam va'elach kiyonek sheket, divrei Rabbi Eliezer. So this actually, it's not Tanakam, it's Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer says after that, it's like nursing, suckling from a non-kosher animal. That sounds very harsh. Talk about this soon. Rabbi Yoshua Omer, afilu arba v'chamesh shanim, even 4 or 5 years. And in fact, we're going to paskin this way. You have till 4 or 5 years. And he says 4 for a weaker child, 4 for a stronger child, 5 for a weaker child. However, if the mother stopped nursing the child after the 24 months was over and then came back to it, we're going to have to see later how much time did she stop. We'll get back to that in a little bit. And then she goes back. That already is kionek sheketz and not appropriate. So now, Becky, you're asking exactly the Gemara's question, which is, how can you call this? It's like eating from a non-kosher animal. It sounds like they're saying that breast milk isn't kosher. And that's a very weird thing because breast milk is kosher. And not only that, we're going to see it in a Tanaitic source that breast milk is kosher and there's no issue whatsoever with it. So we're going to get there right now. So Amar Mar. So now we're quoting from this braita, Mikam va'elach yonek sheketz, right? Any beyond that, you're like a yonek sheketz, right? Which was both in Rabbi Eliezer and in Rabbi Yoshua. Uremidu. This contradicts the following source. It's a midrash halacha. Yachol yehe chalav mahalchei shtayim tamei. You might have thought the milk that comes out of humans, which are mahalchei shtayim, they walk on two legs, would be impure. Vidinu, and it would be logical to say that. Why? Uma behema shehi kalta b'maga'a. They're going to compare laws of impurity to laws of kashrus. So you might have thought a behema, an animal, which when the animal is alive, the animal never contracts impurity, can never pass on impurity. An animal who's alive, only when the animal's dead, it can. Nevela, right? If the animal dies, it has tuma nevela. And if you touch it, you're tamei. But when the animal's alive, there's no such thing as tuma by a live animal. So we're lenient when it comes to touching it. Hechmarta bechalva. But in a non-kosher animal, it's forbidden to drink the milk. Adam shechmarta b'maga'o. So if you have a human, which it's actually, you can't always touch a human, right? There's all sorts of cases where a human who came in contact with a dead body, passes on tumah, a nida, a zava, a zav, a matzora. All those people pass on impurity. So it's more strict. Wouldn't you think then logic would state that also the milk of humans would be not kosher? Talmud Lomar, therefore it says, Et hagamal ki ma'ale gerahu. The camel is forbidden to you because it chews its cud. And then it says the word who. You didn't need the word who. You could just say because it chews its cud. Why would you say it specifically? Who, he, or however you would translate that word here. But it's emphasizing this and not other things. Hu tamei, so he is not kosher, the camel. And obviously his milk is not kosher. Ve'en chalav mahalchei shtayim tamei ela tahol. But milk that comes out of a human, meaning things that come out of a human are going to be pure. Okay, meaning it's coming to exclude human milk. Yachol otzi et hachalav she'eno shaveh b'kol v'lo otzi et adam shu shaveh b'kol. By the way, the actual source of the Midrash Halacha comes up from Torat Kohanim, which is also known as the Sifra. It's the Midrash Halacha on Vayikra. And instead of saying dam there, it says basar. It's talking about the flesh of human flesh. It's a whole debate about human flesh, what the status is. Is it actually now kosher, or do we just not eat it because it's not shechted properly, or all sorts of reasons? So cannibalism comes actually out of this Midrash in its original source, not in our text here, but it's very interesting. So you might have thought that chalav, I'll exclude because chalav is not equal. I will say the chalav, the milk of humans, is okay because chalav is something that kosher animals, you can drink their milk, and non-kosher animals, you can't. So that's what we call eno shaveh b'kol, meaning not all animals is it forbidden. So the milk we already see is a little bit less strict as opposed to dam. You might think v'lo otziat adam. Maybe human blood is forbidden just like animal blood, because hu shaveh b'kol, because all animals' blood is forbidden, right? Kol dam lo tochelu, all animals' blood. So maybe that all animals' blood would also include all human blood. Okay, since the blood of animals is more strict than the milk, because there is some milk that comes from animals that we can drink, which we do all the time. So maybe also blood would be forbidden for humans because it's more strict. Talmud Lomar, who, that same who comes to say, hu tameh ve'ein dam al cheshtayim tameh ela tahol. The blood of humans is actually permitted to eat. Now, how can we learn two things from who? So there's two possible answers, right? Normally we only learn one drasha from each word. If you say it's all part of the same drasha, who is coming to say just the camel and not humans, not for milk and not for blood? Or some people actually have a different version, which actually learns it from a different word, which is zeh, as opposed to who, and therefore that would answer that question. In any case, blood is 5, so is milk, and Amar Rav Sheshet afilu mitzvah prisha embo. And comes Rav Sheshet and he adds to this braita and says, even separating from it, meaning even the rabbis didn't forbid it. In other words, sometimes you might say it's permitted by the Torah, but the rabbis forbade it. Even the rabbis didn't forbid it. So how could you possibly say that nursing from a child above the age of 4 or 5, or according to Rabbi Eliezer, above the age of 2, is like eating from is like nursing from a non-kosher animal? So, to which the Gemara answers, lo kashya had de parish had de lo parish. It depends if the milk is outside the body of the woman or inside the body. If it's still inside the body, then it's forbidden and it's like it's yonik sheket. If it's outside the body, then it's permitted. And this seems to be, I just want to look at one thing. I forget exactly. I was having trouble following the logic, so I don't remember it exactly. But there was this, 1 second. Yeah, there was a, 1 second. Let's go parish. Right. People might think, they were worried that people would think that if they see someone suckling from a woman when they're already older, people will think that maybe milk from a non-kosher animal is permitted. I don't know why you would think that. But if the milk is already separated and it's in a jug, no one's going to know that that milk was breast milk, and therefore they won't confuse it and think, oh, maybe non-kosher animals' milk is permitted. Why you would think that people would think non-kosher animals permitted if an older kid, it's very hard to understand this exactly why you would think that. But there's some answers offered, but again, the question is much better than the answers. And the Gemara says, v'chilufa b'dam. It's actually the exact opposite when it comes to blood. If I'm bleeding in my mouth and it comes out and drops onto a piece of bread, okay, it sounds a little disgusting, but you have to scrape off the blood off the bread. You can't eat it. So blood that comes out of humans, even though human blood is actually permitted, they were stricter with blood that comes out of a human body. But shebena shinaim, if you have blood in your teeth, motzit so ve'eno choshesh. You can suck on the blood, you don't have an issue, right? Or there's blood in your body, that's not problematic. Dafka, the rabbis forbade it when it comes out of your body. Then, I guess since all blood is forbidden, this actually makes more sense. All blood is forbidden. If you see blood, you're going to think, oh, I can eat human blood, I can also eat other blood. If it's in your mouth and you just swallow it, it's not really like anyone thinks you're really eating it. I don't think you ever think about the fact that you're eating blood if that happens to you, right? It's not exactly an act of eating. Okay. Whereas with the nursing, I think it's actually an issue that they're not really discussing, which is, right, it's exactly, I see, Becky, you're going with the lines of what I wanted to say today, which is, I think with the nursing, they just didn't want people nursing children when they were older. So even though they're not saying it directly, I think that's what they're getting at. To drink breast milk, there's nothing wrong. It's not kosher. Kionek sheketz also, sheketz is often used as a term just saying it's disgusting, it's despicable. We don't want this kind of activity going on. And it doesn't really mean it's not kosher. They're just trying to say that it's more the issue of we don't want this going on. It's already not appropriate at that age. And maybe that's why they call it, even though the Gemara doesn't read it that way, but it could be the Gemara's kind of going that way. And that's why they distinguish between had parish, had the low parish, because once it's outside, there's no issue of that whole thing of nursing, which is at a certain age, everyone agrees that at a certain age, it's inappropriate. You might have a disagreement about what that age is, but everyone agrees that for sure, at a much older age, it would be totally inappropriate to be nursing. And maybe that's really what they're getting at. Again, like I said, with the previous sugya, sometimes they're having this discussion in halachic terminology when they're really trying to get at something much different. And you wonder, why didn't they just say that? Well, that's a good question, but I think it's a stylistic thing. Again, we're not living in those days. We don't read books, many other books that were written in those days, but it's the style. Tanya. Now we're talking about a totally different topic. Oh no, I skipped something. Amar Rabbi Yoshua Omer afilu arba v'chamesh shanim. V'hatanya. So now we're going to go back to this 4 or 5 years. V'hatanya, but doesn't say in a braita. Rabbi Yoshua Omer afilu chabilato al ktefav. Even if he carries a satchel on his back, on his shoulders, which sounds like a different age that they're talking about. To which they say, no, idi v'idi chad shiurahu. Rabbi Yoshua was just describing it in different ways. Okay, and you really meant all the same thing. This is very common. We saw this on the first daf of Shas, if you remember. I know it was a long while back, but in Brachot, when did the Kohanim eat truma? And there were all different descriptions. And then they said, well, he seems to contradict himself. And then they say, oh no, he was just describing it in different words, and it really means all the same thing. Amar Rav Yosef, halachah Rabbi Yoshua, and in fact, they paskin like Rabbi Yoshua that it is 4 or 5 years. Okay, moving on. So now we're a little bit moving on topics. We're still talking about nursing, but we're talking about number 1, nursing on Shabbat, which is a totally different issue. And we're not talking about nursing from a mother. We're actually talking about a different kind of nursing. You'll see in a minute. Rabbi Marinos, okay, Tanya, it's a braita. Rabbi Marinos says, Gonech yonek halab b'Shabbat. If you're gonech, many different interpretations of what it is, whether you're coughing, you have some sort of disease or something where you desperately need milk, okay? And you can't find milk anywhere, so you can suckle from an animal on Shabbat, obviously a kosher animal we're talking about. My taima, and what even is the issue? Well, the issue is that when you do the action of nursing, it's actually a melacha on Shabbat. It's a tolada, which is a subcategory of the melacha of dash. Dash is threshing. You take out the wheat from the chaff. So you're basically taking out, now there's different ways to describe this, either something from its encasement, from its wrapping. Some people say it's actually, in the current translation, you'll see they say the edible from the inedible. Okay, even though not all mefarek is actually, it's called mefarek. Okay, dash is the melacha, subcategory is mefarek, which is extracting something from where it's enclosed. Whether it's specifically edible from inedible, that is the wheat from the chaff is edible from inedible. Some people don't say it's edible and edible because there are cases of mefarek where it's not inedible from edible, but it's edible from edible, but it's kind of something is wrapped inside something else. And it's a melacha. Some people actually have, in Masechet Shabbat, there's a diyun about what exactly is the melacha. Some people say it's memachek, smoothing out, like what they would do the hide of the animal and smoothing. How they get to that's good. It's a little more complicated. Anyway, there's other possibilities of what the issue is, but here it seems clear the Gemara thinks it's mefarek. But it's mefarek k'la'achar yad. It's an atypical manner. You don't usually take the milk out of an animal by suckling it. Okay, that's not how humans take it out usually. And bimkom tzara lo gazru barabanan. If you're in pain and suffering, so the rabbis didn't make their gzerah. So basically, when you do it with a shinoi, with a change, that already drops it to Rabbanan. Once it's to Rabbanan, rabbinic law only, then you can get out of it by saying, oh, well, you're in pain. Okay, now, this, by the way, is why there's an issue of, so first of all, why is it not refuah? Refuah, generally, if it's something you could theoretically drink, then you're actually allowed to drink it for refuah purposes. Like if there's some health drink that helps you feel better and it will help you with your disease, you're allowed to drink it. That also comes up in Shabbat, if you remember. Tosfot talks about it. Obviously, we're not talking about someone who's in danger. If they were in danger, life-threatening, obviously it wouldn't even be a question. You wouldn't even, you could do it in a normal manner. Anyway, there's also a sugya that seems to contradict because it says you could do this specifically on Yantif, which sounds like it's not permitted on Shabbos. And then what else? Why does it say, now it says here, Amar Rav Yosef, halachah Rabbi Marinos, we paskin like him. So how do we deal with the fact that this other sugya says only on Yantif? So some people say, oh, that's why it says here, halachah Rabbi Marinos. Nobody disagreed with him here, but they disagree with him elsewhere. And that's why they're telling you. Some say only on Yantif. He says even on Shabbos. Okay. So now, again, it's permitted to do this because I see you're asking, why isn't it permitted for refuah? It is, I think, permitted for refuah. In other words, since this is something you need and you're sick, again, there's a debate whether he's actually sick or whether it's just he's very, very thirsty or something like that, or forget exactly what they said, but there's a debate about what exactly the case is. It's not 100% clear, but for that, we permit it. By the way, it's the same reason why we permit a woman to express on Shabbat, express her breast milk if she's in pain, right? If it's very painful, you're not really allowed to express unless you're giving it to the child. That's like a way of nursing. It's actually a tolada of dash, it's mefarek if you express the milk, like let's say you express it into a bottle. But if you're in a lot of pain, you're allowed to do it. Generally, they have you do it onto the ground so that you don't collect it. That's more of the problem. But there's particular situations where they'll permit even that. So if you ever have a question, you should ask about it. It's a bit of a complicated issue, but there is room for permission here. Tanya Nachamishgal Yomer, if we're already on the topic of Shabbat and things that are permitted for certain circumstances, we're now getting off topic. Sinor Shalubo Kashkashin, if you have a gutter on your roof and it's backed up with lots of grass collected in it, this happens probably to anyone who owns a house. And the water is leaking into your house right now on Shabbat. Hopefully it doesn't happen to you on Shabbat, but it stopped up and you didn't think to clean it out before Shabbat, and the water starts dripping into your house. So what do? As long as nobody is looking at you and it's more in a private area, you're allowed to trample it with your feet, which is not the typical way of, normally you pull it out with your hands. Trample it on your feet because, again, you're fixing something. You're not allowed to fix. That's a tolada subcategory of makeh bepatish, which is putting the final blow on the utensil that you're building. So this is mitaken kila achar yadu, but it's with a shinoi, it's with a change. And bimkom seidas, it's a big loss. When there's a big financial loss involved, lo gazru barabanan, the rabbis did not forbid. And I'm Rav Yosef halacha kenachlam ishkalia. So Rav Yosef paskin, like both of these people who permitted things on Shabbat, either because of tsar or pain or discomfort, and because of financial loss. Right, back to our nursing issue. If you stop and go back, if you're past the 24-month mark and you stop nursing and you go back to it, that's already not allowed. But the question is, how long did you stop for? Rav Yehuda bar Chaviva, Amar Shmuel, shlosha yamim. Okay, so Rav Yehuda bar Chaviva says in the name of Shmuel, 3 days. Stop for 3 days. Commentaries say not if, let's say, the child was sick and wasn't willing to nurse at all. I would assume also if the mother, for whatever reason, couldn't nurse because she was sick and maybe had a breast infection, something, then I also imagine it would be the same thing. It wouldn't count. But if there was an intentional break of 3 days, that's already one can't go back. Some people say, and this is just a minor change, which is Tani Rav Yehuda bar Chaviva Kamei Shmuel. Instead of Rav Yehuda bar Chaviva quoting Shmuel, Rav Yehuda bar Chaviva quoted a braita saying this shlosha yamim in front of Shmuel, as opposed to him quoting it in the name of Shmuel. Tanu Rabbanan. Now we get to another issue, which we actually saw in Yevamot, and we're going to see it, a much more expanded version of this in our daf today. Whole bunch of opinions about this that we didn't see when we learned it in Yevamot. A very strange sugya, which we thought it was strange when we learned it in Yevamot. Meineket shemet ba'ala b'toch 24 chodesh. If she's nursing and her husband dies within 24 months, harezo lo titares velo tinase ad 24 chodesh. She can't get married or even get betrothed within 24 months of the death of her husband. Divrei Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Yehuda matir b'18 chodesh. Okay, this opinion we did not see at the time, that Rabbi Yehuda says it's 18 months and not 24 months. Now, what's the idea here? The idea here is we're concerned that when she gets married, and we don't even allow betrothal because she might get married, we want to just prevent marriage entirely. So if she gets married, she might get pregnant. If she gets pregnant, what will happen? So she will, let me be clear. It's from the 24 months from the birth of the child, not from the death of the husband. So she needs to wait 24 months so that she makes sure she nurses her child for the full 24 months. Because if she gets pregnant, what's the concern? The concern is she'll get pregnant, her milk will dry up. Then the baby will be in danger. Now, you'd say, okay, well, you can hire a wet nurse, but who's going to pay for that? You think her new husband's going to pay for it? Likely, he's not going to want to pay for that. You have to remember, she doesn't really have her own money. So her money becomes her husband's money when she gets married. So she can't even really hire the wet nurse on her own unless she, begs her family members to help her. But basically, that child could be in danger because of now here it's hard to believe, right? That the husband will say, I don't really care about your child. It'd be hard to imagine, but that's the concern. The concern is it's not his child. What will he care? And it's danger to the child, so we don't allow the mother to get remarried. So he says the same machlok between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda, 18 months or 24 months is the same as Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel. Beit Shammai omrim 24 chodesh. He says 24 months. Ubeit Hillel omrim 18 chodesh. Now I'll remind you, when we learned this in Yevamot, we only saw 24 months as far as I remember. I don't remember seeing this 18 months, which is very interesting because Beit Shammai is the one who says 24 months. We don't usually hold by Beit Shammai. And now there's going to be a few discussions that are going to ensue. The first is another Tanaitic opinion. Amar Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, ani achriya. Usually it means I'm going to decide. But the issue here is not really decide. I'm going to set down the law that what? Depending on who you hold like, it's not exactly as it seems. L'divrei ha'omer 24 chodesh muteret linaseh be 21 chodesh. it's 3 months before whatever they say. The one who says 24 months, it's really 21 months. She can actually get married after 15 months. Another thing they believe, which I didn't check out what's true nowadays, but I imagine it's not exactly this way, but that it takes 3 months before your milk dries up once being pregnant. Could be there's some truth to it, I don't know. But in any case, they believe that there was a concern that it would take 3 months to dry up. Rabban Shimon Gamliel says this, and therefore he basically says it's 3 months before the day that they say. Because one assumes really 18 months is the normal period of nursing and the other 24 months. And then the point is basically, or maybe Beit Hillel thinks a child can manage after 18 months without being nursed. So that's fine. And then you have the extra 3 months where you can get married 3 months earlier because it'll take that time till your milk dries up. Amar Ula halakha ki Rabbi Yehuda. And in fact, we paskin like Rabbi Yehuda, which again, you might be thinking this is strange. This is not what we saw in Yevamot, hold off, where it's 18 months. And Amar Merukva lihi tir Rabbi Chanina laset lachar 15 chodesh. Merukva said, Rabbi Chanina permitted me to get married after 15 months based on Rabbi Yehuda plus Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel 3 months before, 15 months. Right, again, 15 months I wanted to marry this woman from the time her last child was born, knowing her husband had died. Arise de Abaye. Now we have a case. The sharecropper of Abaye's, Ata the Kamed Abaye, came before his rabbi and said, Amarle, Maule Ares b'chamishasar chodesh. Can I get married after 15 months? Amarle, Chada de Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yehuda, Lachak Rabbi Yehuda. So I guess, Abaye starts thinking in his head, well, we have Rabbi Meir, we have Rabbi Yehuda normally, and we have Machlok Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yehuda, we hold like Rabbi Yehuda, who said 18. And Be'od, Beit Shammai, Beit Hillel, Hachak Beit Hillel. And if you want to look at the other Machloket, well, we usually hold like Beit Hillel, also said 18 months. And Amar Ula halachak Rabbi Yehuda, and Ula paskin that way. And Amar Meruk v'liyiti Rabbi Chanina l'aseh lachar 15 chodesh. You would have said the same thing as Abaye. All that we've learned until now seems to prove 15 months is totally fine. Kol shekein da'ali ares, and all the more so for you because you're only getting engaged, right? So of course it's not an issue. You're not even getting married yet. And you might say, why is engaged permitted? I saw the question in the chat. Why is engaged forbidden? Because engagement leads to marriage. And if you remember, she's already an almanah, so she only has 30 days. After 30 days, she would normally, theoretically, again, assuming he proposed marriage to her also, they could get married. And, it's just better to avoid it. So Abaye paskin for this person. Then we don't know how long after, but presumably not so long after, he goes before Rav Yosef, who was his rabbi. Amarle, and he told, right, so they don't say this, but Abaye told him what happened. And Rav Yosef says to him, Rav Shmuel da Amar Travayu tzricha lamtin 24 chodesh chutz miyom shenola bo v'chutz miyom shenit'arsa bo. He says, what'd you do? Rav and Shmuel, forget all the opinions you quoted. Rav and Shmuel, right, the first Amoraim, the big rabbis, both said you have to wait 24 months, and you don't include the day the kid was born, and you don't include the day she was betrothed, meaning you have to have 24 full months in between. So now Abaye is really upset because he told this guy that he could go get married, and now he's got to go find him. So, and stop the marriage. He ran after him 3 parasangs, but Amrle Parsa B'chala, and some people say it was only 1 parasang, but it was in sand dunes. And try running in sand dunes, right? You don't get anywhere very quickly. Below Adrache, and he didn't reach him. Okay, so he told this guy he could get married too early, and now he doesn't know how to reach the guy to stop him. So he feels terrible, and he goes and he starts thinking about things, and he says the following. Whenever you make a mistake, you try to backtrack. What threw me off? So Amar Abaye, Hi Milta, and what's the lesson to be learned from this? He says, Hi Milta da Amar Rabban, and this is what the rabbis say. Afilu be'ata b'kutcha lo lishrei inish b'mkom Rabbi. Even to eat eggs with kutach. Kutach hababli was this drink, this food that was like kind of sour milk, which almost maybe sounds a little like it was a yogurt kind of thing with breadcrumbs in it and some other things. It was a dip that they would have with their bread in Bavel. And to eat it with an egg. Now, some people say what it means is that an egg, don't think an egg is meat, because it comes from a chicken, right? And it's bisari, but it's fleischiks. No, you can eat it with dairy. Okay, now that's a pretty easy question. I could ask any of you that and you would tell me that answer. So maybe he means even something like that. Okay, now what does he want to say? Lo lishrei inish b'mkom Rabbi. Don't permit it if your rabbi's in the town. Okay, if your rabbi's in the vicinity, do not permit such a thing. Even, right, don't give a heter to someone for something even so obvious. Some people say, no, that's ridiculous. There's no way you can't tell somebody that you can eat an egg with kutach, right? Anybody can do that. Must be talking about something more complicated. And some parshaniyot, it all depends on, where in the scale of simple to complicated you put this case, but I'll leave that out there. The main point is you shouldn't give a heter to someone when your rabbi's in the vicinity. Lo mishum demerse kaf kiruta, not because it looks like hefker, like you don't care about your rabbi and lack of respect. It's usually what we say when we talk about this. Ela mishum de lo mistaya milta lememra, because you don't have siyata dishmaya, as we say. You don't have God helping you in that. In other words, it sounds like he believes like there's siyata dishmaya one in the town, and it goes all to the head of the smartest rabbi in the town or the most prominent. And I didn't have siyata dishmaya when I made this. Now, why does siyata dishmaya play in here? Daha ana have a gemir lahada Rabban Shimon. When I was going through my head and I was saying, oh, well, there's Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Meir, and we hold like Rabbi Yehuda, and there's Beit Shammai, Beit Hillel, and we hold like Beit Hillel. I totally forgot. I learned Rabban Shimon, but I totally forgot it. In other words, even though I learned Rabban Shmuel, I didn't remember it. Why didn't I remember it? Probably because I didn't have siyata dishmaya, because I was doing something wrong. Doing something wrong, God doesn't help you. So basically, it says that's why you should always make sure to include God, and you should always make sure, not to include God, to basically go to your rabbi and let him do it, because he's got God kind of with him. So he felt really bad, obviously, about what he did, and then tried to come out with a moral lesson. Tanu Rabbanan, new braita. That's not binala meineket, ogamalto, omed, muteret linaseh miyad. Okay, you were probably thinking about this. What if you weren't nursing at all? What if you gave your child to a nursemaid, or you weaned him already from nursing, or the child died? Then you'd be allowed to get married immediately, because this is not a relevant issue, this 24 months. But Papa Rav Yosef, several about uvda kiyamatnita, they wanted to pass him like this. Amalu ayisafta, this elderly woman came and said, Bedidi havi uvda, this happened to me, va'asrli Rav Nachman, and he wouldn't allow me. What's the concern? The concern is, certainly with the first two, you might hire a nursemaid just so that you can go get married, or you might wean your child just so that you can go get married, and they want to avoid that. So, and also we usually say lo plug, we don't distinguish. So that would explain the death, right? You're not going to obviously have a mother try to kill her child so that she'd get married, but hold off on that. You might see somebody thinks that. The Rav Nachman sharu bereish kaluta. But wait, how could you say that Rav Nachman forbade it to you? This is the Gemara asking, they're not asking her directly, but didn't Rav Nachman allow, in the Reish Galuta, they hired nursemaids. They generally, that was a place where they had a lot of servants, they had nursemaids, and the women were allowed to get married within 24 months. So they say, no, Shani Bereish Galuta to lo hadru b'hu. In that case, now the Reish Galuta was, number one, wealthy. He was the exilarch. He was the head of Babylonia. He was very wealthy. And they were also known to have thugs there. We've seen a bunch of stories with the thugs there. There was one case where they did something with the mavoi, and then they beat him up, and they had a disagreement of halacha, and they didn't like the way he did it, and they beat him up, if you remember. It's a lot of thug things going on there, bullying. If their house hired a nursemaid, there's no way she would have basically disappeared. But if I hire a nursemaid, she might disappear on me, not show up to work, and I'll have to nurse my own child, in which case, if I got married and my milk dried up and we're stuck. So because of that, right, we all know you can't really rely on other people, right? But if you're the Reish Galuta, you can. So that's why he allowed them. You have to remember, Rav Nachman was also the rabbi of the Reish Galuta. He always was like their right-hand rabbi. Amalu Rav Pape. But wait, what about this source? And now we're talking about a different issue, but it's a very similar thing. Okay, now we're talking about the 3-month waiting period. If you remember, a woman, husband dies or gets divorced, she has to wait 3 months before she gets remarried to make sure we don't have mamzerim issues. We know who the father of the child is in case it was born. There are 7-month babies, there's 9-month babies. That's why we have to wait the 3 months to ensure that we know the baby's 100% from the new husband. So she was always in her father's house and never with her husband before the marriage was dissolved. Or there was we all knew they were living in separate bedrooms because there was a lot of animosity between them. Basically, these are going to be all situations where this just isn't relevant. He was in jail. He was abroad. He was old or sick. She was barren. She was old. She was an ilonit. She was a tana. She was a woman who couldn't have children, or she was too young to have children. And therefore, this is just not an issue. Or she had a miscarriage after the husband died. Or she can't have children. How that's different than the others? It's a good question. Sorry, I want to correct my translation. Some people pointed out it wasn't nice. Akara means basically she's childless. All these women need to wait 3 months. Tivrei Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Yosef matir le'ares v'le'nasei miyad. Amar Rav Nachman Amar Shmuel halacha Rabbi Meir b'gzeirotav. So we hold like Rabbi Meir here. She has to wait 3 months no matter what, even though this is a totally irrelevant issue for her. So how could you make a distinction? Amarlei lavadat, and he said, I didn't know this. The hilchata and the halacha is meit mutal k'malto asul. But in the end, they say we're going to distinguish between if the child died, then there's really no issue. If the child is still alive, then there's more of an issue, and then we're not going to permit it. Even if the child died, we're not going to distinguish. Why? Here's the crazy line. Maybe she'll kill her child just so she can go get remarried. That's a little bit insane. In fact, but he says, and there was a case when the woman strangled her child in order to remarry, a little bit insane. But the Gemara says, we don't hold this way. She was obviously not of sound mind, this woman, because women do not strangle their children. Do not worry. Okay, Tanu Rabbanan. Last part for today. You take a job as a nursemaid. Here are some rules. You can't nurse your own child, and you can't nurse anyone else's child. Piska kama, if they give you a little bit of kima, if they give you a little bit of food to eat when they made the deal with you, well, ochelet harbe, you still have to eat more because you have to have enough to produce your milk. Lo tochali mo dvarim ha'ra'im lechalam, you can't eat food that's bad for the child. We all know that there's certain foods you eat that affect the child. So shouldn't eat that. So now they say, okay, let's go back to that braita. You can't feed your child. Obviously, obviously you can't feed someone else's child. We don't allow you to feed your own. You might have thought she might have more rachmanut on her child, and she'll feed him, she'll give him more milk than the one who she committed to. But to the friend, if she agrees her friend's child, she might just wait to see if she has extra. If she has extra, she'll give the other child, but not if she doesn't. Hamash Malan comes teach you, no, even that you can't. Who has to pay for the extra food? Now, this is good business message. She has to pay out of pocket. It was her fault for not making sure that they committed to her when they hired her for the job to give her enough of what she needed to eat. What are these bad foods? These are certain things that grow from the ground. I'm not going to go through all the translations just because of time. You can look them up. It's small fish, dirt. People would eat soil. Sometimes there's women who have cravings for soil, actually, when they're nursing, supposedly. Abaye marfilu chavusha, quince and gourds. Rapapa marfilu kara, which should be really kora, which is from the palm tree, the kufra, which are dates that are not ripe. Arav Ashem marfilu kamcha harsana, that's the kutach, and this fish fried in flour. Minayu paska chalva, minayu achre chalva. Some of them are bad because it causes your milk to dry up, and some of them are bad because it ruins the milk, right? We all know kids get, bad colicky and stuff from depending on what you eat and all that. So this is advice of the rabbis, what you should eat and not eat. And it becomes halachic because if you're a meineket, you actually have a responsibility to watch what you're eating, right? If you're hired as a wet nurse in order to make sure that you do your job properly. Okay, the next sugya is going to be a little complicated. We're going to start it complicated, not complicated technically, but complicated to swallow. We're going to start it tomorrow and long daf for today. Okay, but very interesting, all about nursing mothers, wet nurses, etc. So this is the daf for women nursing. Okay, have a good day, everyone. Shabbat tov.